Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm talking about Dungeons and Dragons retro clones. And as the title of the video suggests, are D&D retro clones worth your time? And so, uh, I'm gonna have to define what D&D is a little bit, and what is a D&D retro clone a little bit. So, for those who aren't familiar, and even if you are, here's a recap. Dungeons and Dragons is a tabletop role playing game where you get together with friends and you tell stories and you act out those stories using characters that you make up, and you use dice to determine the outcomes of your actions. It's a shared story, is what it is. You know, kind of like that campfire game where you sit around a campfire and one person tells a little bit of a story and then the next person tells the next piece of the story, and so on and so forth. D&D is kind of a more advanced, more structured version of that, which is pretty fucking cool. I love Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons started in 1974, and when it started, it was an offshoot to wargaming, specifically a game called Chainmail. And so it was very rules heavy at the time, in that there weren't a lot of rules, but the rules were very strict and very complicated. And you had to have a wargaming background to understand the rules because they were not explained in the books. So if you didn't know what a term meant, you either had to buy Chainmail and look it up, or you couldn't Google it. You couldn't ask somebody. You just had to, make it up on as you went. So that's the gist of it. Dungeons and Dragons was split into two in the late 70s. There was Dungeons and Dragons, which fans refer to as basic Dungeons and Dragons. And then there was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which fans refer to as AD&D. AD&D created the format we're familiar with today. 3 hardback books: Monster Manual, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide. But Basic Dungeons and Dragons was a simplified version of D&D. And Basic D&D comes in different flavors. You've got you got Original D&D, which some call Zero Edition. You have the 1976 Basic Edition. You have the 1981 BX Edition, Basic Expert Edition. You have the 1983 BECME Edition, which is Basic, Expert, Companion, Master, and Immortal, which was repackaged in 1991 as the Rules Cyclopedia. And then on the AD&D front, you have First Edition and Second Edition, and then Basic D&D, when Wizards of the Coast bought it in 97, and they released Dungeons and Dragons 3rd Edition in 2000, what they did was they just essentially merged the two products into one. But really what they did was they just renamed Advanced Dungeons and Dragons as just Dungeons and Dragons. And they just canceled Basic Dungeons and Dragons is what they did. In practice, So, with the transition from First Edition to Second Edition AD&D, what you had was a revision. Second Edition AD&D was not really a completely new game. It was just a revision of D&D or AD&D First Edition to make it more accessible, easier to understand, it took all this stuff from all the supplements and it just repackaged it into the core rule books so that you didn't have to buy 7 books to get all the options. You could just buy the core rule books and get all the options. So that's what it was, a simplified version of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. But then it took on a life of its own. And then subsequent editions of Dungeons and Dragons are reinventions of the game with each edition. 3rd edition is a brand new game called Dungeons and Dragons. 4th edition is a brand new game called Dungeons and Dragons, and so on and so forth. So you have gamers in the gaming community that are old. You got grognards, old timers, these old farts that, just want to play the game how they played it as a kid because they got nostalgia. It's the equivalent of, somebody in their 40s, 50s, 60s, etc., who just play Atari or Nintendo NES all day because that's what they grew up with, and that's all they want. They just want what they had as a kid. And so you have a couple of options when it comes to playing old school Dungeons and Dragons. Option number 1 is to seek out the original books. Since these books are out of print, for the most part, there's a caveat. Since these books are out of print, they're hard to find, and some of them can be expensive, especially if you give a shit about quality. If you don't care about quality, you can get them relatively cheap. But if you want ones that are pristine, that look like they just came off of a bookshelf at a Barnes & Noble, you're going to pay out the ass for them. And I'm talking $400, $500, $600 for a book. Not $50, $60. We're talking expensive books. Hella expensive books. Okay? When Wizards of the Coast bought when they bought TSR and they released Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition and its follow-up 3.5 edition, or its revision, I guess I would say, they created what is known as the Open Game License. And what this does is it allows other companies that aren't TSR or Wizards of the Coast, in this case, to create their own Dungeons and Dragons compatible content without having to pay royalties to Wizards of the Coast and without using Wizards of the Coast trademarks. So, for example, you can publish your own player's handbook that just rewords all of the rules and says, well, just simplifies it or takes options or whatever. This is how Pathfinder was born. Pathfinder is Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 edition, but it's the equivalent of 2nd edition to AD&D as Pathfinder is to 3rd edition. So it's like they took all the supplements and everything and they just, pared it down to one book. That's what Pathfinder is. Pathfinder is sometimes referred to as 3.75 edition. And that did satiate some people who were okay with 3.0, 3.5 edition when 4th edition came along and they rejected it because 4th edition was rejected. However, there were other people who realized they could use that open game license as an opportunity to restate the classic versions of Dungeons and Dragons, using the open game license. So you have what are known as Dungeons and Dragons retro clones. Examples would be Castles and Crusades, Osric, etc. Tunnels and Trolls, I think, is another one. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. I think Tunnels and Trolls is, but I don't know. That might be a separate game. But I know Castles and Crusades is, and I know Osric is. So you have the option of buying one of these books, which are still in print in some cases, so you can get them for a fair price. You can play D&D, 1st edition, OD&D, Basic, BECME, etc., without actually going out of your way to buy all these retro books. That's one option. The other option is to either buy or download PDFs of the old books. Some people want a physical book. Some people are okay with a PDF. Now, remember when I said these old books are kind of sort of out of print? Well, again, going back to the OGL, but also what we refer to in the tabletop gaming community as the old school renaissance, there is a couple of companies that have risen up. The most notable is Drive-Thru RPG. And what they do is they license these books from Wizards of the Coast and get permission to reprint them themselves. These are reproductions. And so you have the option of buying a PDF from them of the original book or a reproduction of a reprint. And the reproductions are basically, a recreation of the book. So they're like, not identical, but like, close enough that if you don't care about having an exact original, they're good enough. So if you can get access to the original books or the original PDFs of those books, then what's the point of the retro clone? Right? I have read every edition of Dungeons and Dragons, the core rule books of every book of every edition of Dungeons and Dragons. The original Dungeons and Dragons, I read all the booklets. Basic Dungeons and Dragons, I read the whole booklet. BX, I read both books. BECMI, I read all 5 books. I read the Rule Cyclopedia. I read the 3 core rule books of AD&D first and second edition. I read the 3 core rule books of 3.0, 3.5, 4th edition, 5th edition. I've read them all. The core rule books. The ones that are necessary to play the game. The essential rule books. I've also read optional ones. Likewise, I have read the PDFs of all the retro clones. The equivalent retro clone to the D&D book. And again, the retro clones are not what you remember. And I'll give you an example. Osric is an example. Osric is the retro clone of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition. Now, on the surface, as you're reading through Osric, it's going to sound familiar enough that you're going to be like, you know what? This is what I remember. This is AD&D. However, there's one big change that makes it just different enough that it's almost like, well, now you're not playing old school D&D anymore. You're playing new school D&D with old school character classes and races and options. But, it's still new D&D. And that change is THAC0. THAC0 refers to 2-hit armor class 0. I am not going to attempt at all to explain THAC0 because I can't fucking wrap my head around it. I couldn't explain it if I tried because I don't understand it. And that's the reason why Wizards of the Coast simplified Dungeons & Dragons with 3rd edition in the first place. Because every edition TSR published used THAC0. They didn't all call it THAC0, but they all used that same system. And Osric gives you a choice. They don't call it THAC0. They call it Ascending Armor Class or Descending Armor Class. I know that's confusing. In AD&D, Basic D&D, Original D&D, you had, like I said, THAC0. What it was a 0 armor class was the best armor you could get. So an armor class of 17 sucked. An armor class of -8 was fucking awesome. You still rolled a 20-sided dice, a d20. So if a monster's armor class was 6, you weren't rolling a 6 on the d20 to hit it. You had to figure out what your THAC0 was, your THAC0 being whatever number you had to roll to hit a 0, and then you had to use a chart to calculate the difference between 0 and, in this case, 6, and then do some math and figure out what number you had to roll to hit a 6. That's Descending Armor Class. 3.0 on introduced the concept of ascending armor class. What that means is there is no zero armor. Zero would be no armor at all. Your skin is your arm AC of your base armor is armor class 10. And then as you add armor, your armor class goes up. So rolling a 20-sided dice, it's easy. It's like, well, if your armor class is 13, just without doing any math or looking up any charts, okay, I got to roll a 13 or higher. That's it. Makes it easier. So Osric gives you the option of using one or the other. So it's not even really completely compatible or identical to first edition. Now, me and my friends, we ignored THAC0. And we just did exactly what fucking Wizards did anyways. We just reversed the armor class and used the higher to roll, higher to hit. So if an armor class was 16 or 6, we just took 6 away from 20 and got whatever number that was, and that's the number you had to roll. And that's how we did it. To make it easy. So not everybody used THAC0 back in the day anyways. But that's the big difference between old school D&D and modern, 3.0 on modern D&D. And I think the reason why it isn't so much people want to play D&D how they remember it, because they're not playing it how they remember it, because they're remembering it wrong, for one, and for two, there was no standard D&D. Some people would have the AD&D first edition monster manual, but they would have the 1981 basic and expert books, and then they would have like BECMI modules. So it was a hodgepodge anyways. So everyone's experience of Dungeons and Dragons was unique. And so there was no universal experience of Dungeons and Dragons. So you can't recreate a universal experience of Dungeons and Dragons because it didn't exist. Which is why, consequently, there's so many retro clones, because each one is trying to recreate that experience. However, they're only trying to recreate the official experience. So you have a retro clone that is based on original D&D that is trying to recreate playing original D&D by the book. Except people didn't play original D&D by the book. They made up their own house rules, and they would they would either make up their own campaigns, or they would use a basic or AD&D module and use the original D&D rulebooks, pamphlets, to play through that module, and then just make adjustments as needed. So you really can't replicate that, in a retro clone. Otherwise, you'd have to have a retro clone that uses, let's say, BX armor class and, race and class and stats and spell lists, etc. But the AD&D monster manual with the AD&D monster stats, and you'd have to have a conversion chart. Because that's what a lot of people did. That's how a large chunk of people played D&D. And so you don't really have a retro clone that can recreate that, because when they have their monster lists, they're taking the monster lists that were in the respective books for that compatible edition, not mixing and matching like people did in the real world. And so you're really not getting an authentic retro D&D experience when you play a retro clone. What you're getting is a modern game that is inspired by and reminiscent of the original D&D or the retro D&D games. So again, it comes back to, are D&D retro clones worth your time? And here's how I'm going to break it down. If you're a grognard, whether you embrace that term or consider it offensive, I don't care. If you're one of them grognards one of them old timers who's just stuck in the past, and you grew up playing, I'm going to use Beck Me as an example. You grew up playing Beck Me. You had all 5 booklets, and you only played Beck Me modules, and you only used options and monsters and classes and races and spells from Beck Me. But you don't want to spend a fortune on those Beck Me books, and you don't want PDFs that don't work for you because you're an old timer. You want a physical book. So it might almost be worth it to get the retro clone that is inspired by Beck Me if your experience was exclusive to Beck Me, meaning you didn't, play modules that weren't published for Beck Me, and you didn't use monster books or spell lists from editions outside of Beck Me. Then yeah, that retro clone might work for you. It might. If you were one of those people that, for example, you had the 1976 basic rulebook and you used the AD&D Monster Manual, because when the Monster Manual was published, it came out first because that was the intended purpose. You would use it with your existing book. And then you played an Beck Me module. Beck Me, BX, and Basic D&D are close enough that you could run a Beck Me module using 1976 basic rules, and with very little adjustments get away with it. And like I said, with very little adjustments, you could use an AD&D First Edition Monster Manual. Likewise, with very little adjustments, you could use AD&D Second Edition Monstrous Manuals if you really wanted to. Now, it would require some adjustments, conversions and whatnot, but people did that. There were some people who did that. They only bought the new books. All they wanted were either the new spells or the new character classes, races, etc., new options, or they just wanted the new monsters, So if you're one of those people and you're trying to recreate your childhood experience, you're not going to get it from the retro clones because they're a more pure version of D&D, and if the way you played wasn't that pure, if it was a hodgepodge, the retro clone is going to feel familiar at first on the surface, but as you dig into it, it's going to feel different. You're going to be like, well, I remember this spell or this character class or this monster, but that's not in the retro clone because it wasn't in the official version that retro clone is referencing. And so for you might not get what you're looking for with the retro clone. Now you might, again, mix and match. So for example, we're going to stick with this. You might get the retro clone that is inspired by the 1976 basic, but then you might look for the monster book for the retro clone for Osric's, the Osric monster book, and use that as your your AD&D monster manual. And likewise, whatever character class option book, whatever it was, Oriolan Adventures or whatever it was that you used as your optional references, you might be better off just digging through eBay and finding that book, that original book, and just saying, fuck it, shell out the money. Because in that case, then you're going to get a whole hell of a lot closer to what your childhood experience was. Now, I'm of the belief that a lot of these retro nerds don't really want to play D&D how they played it as a kid. What they want is to play a D&D version that uses Thaco so they can feel superior to people. Because they understand THAC0. And so they feel like they're better than those who don't, or smarter than those who don't. And so they want the retro clones just as a superiority complex. That's it. That's all it is. For them, it's just, they're not really purists. They're just snobs who want to feel better than everybody else. If you're one of those people, yeah, the retro clones are probably for you. So is this middle finger. Stick it up your butt. But if you are a purist, I'm going to be honest with you. The retro clones probably aren't going to cut it because, one, they do clean up the language. So, again, the descriptions of things aren't going to match what you're familiar with either. So it's still going to be different. In other words, unless you're buying the exact series of books you had as a kid and sticking to those exact house rules, you're never going to recreate that using modern books, retro clones or 5th edition or conversions or whatever. You're just not going to. And so for you, it's probably better to just, like I said, either just get the eBay, get the print-on-demand version of the book, or, shell out the cash for an original, depending on whether or not you're okay with the reproduction or not. If you see the reproduction as a knockoff, then you're going to want to track down an original, which is going to cost you an arm and a leg. So, if you got the money, go for it. So, I can't say, yes, retro clones are for you, specifically, viewer, or not, because I don't know what you're looking for. All I can do is spell out what a retro clone is, what it recreates, and which scenarios it might work for. If that's what you're looking for, then yeah, the retro clone is for you. Otherwise, not likely. I'm not going to blanket say, no, retro clones are a waste of time, a waste of money. Fuck it, just pirate the PDFs and, fuck Drive-Through RPG and Wizards and everybody else. I'm not going to do that. Because I buy the original books myself. And I buy books of the retro clones. Yes. And on rare occasions, I buy the print-on-demand reproduction of the books that are too outrageously expensive for me to ever be able to afford. Because I'm not paying $300 for a fucking pamphlet. A 32-page pamphlet. I ain't doing it. If I have to have that pamphlet, I'm going to buy the PDF and just fucking print it myself. Or pirate the PDF. You didn't hear me say that. Yeah, so retro clones are not for everybody. Now, if you're a modern gamer, I know this video is getting long in the tooth, but bear with me. If you're a modern gamer, you're coming from 5th edition or 4th edition or 3rd edition, 3.5, Pathfinder, Dungeon Crawl Classics, or whatever, and you're curious about, let's say, basic, BX. We'll use BX as an. You're curious about BX, but again, you don't want to go through the hassle of buying the old books. You don't really care enough to download the PDFs. You refuse to pirate for whatever reason. And you don't want to pay $10, $15 for a PDF because that's too much money for a PDF. For you, it might be worth your money to get the retro clone so that you can experience that edition of Dungeons & Dragons as close as you can get in modern times. And then decide for yourself if you're going to use ascending or descending armor class. So it's up to you. Again, if you're coming from 5th edition or 4th edition and you're curious about one of these previous editions, the Retro Clone could be a way to go. If you're coming from Dungeon Crawl Classics, you might just stick with Dungeon Crawl Classics because it's already more or less a retro clone anyways. But it's sort of like a reimagining of the old school D&D with a modern twist. So those are your options. There you go. Stay cool.